Hi, everybody. Thanks for calling in on this beautiful day. Would like to introduce my friend Dick Platkin. He was a planner for the city of Los Angeles for many years. He's created all sorts of plans, including community plans, citywide plans, neighborhood plans. He's also opposed a lot of those things since he left the city of Los Angeles and questioned what on earth they're doing and so on. And he has a column in City Watch at Los Angeles, and he puts out his views. And he flies all over the world, as far as I can tell. He's always
not during the pandemic.
Okay. Anyway, I want to introduce Dick Platkin. He'll give you a little bit more of his bio, and then he'll explain some of how we got here on our lack of affordable housing. It's happened in Los Angeles, but it's happening statewide. And of course, the legislature claims that their goal is to create affordable housing, but we don't see any evidence whatsoever that that's what they're trying to do. Go ahead, Dick Platkin.
Okay, thank you, Jill. I have the advantage or disadvantage of being in my 70s. So I have a long history, and that history began in Seattle when I was a Vista volunteer and I lived in public housing. So I know public housing up close because I used to live in it, and the Housing Authority in Seattle contracted with Vista to have Vista volunteers as community organizers in each of the public housing projects in Seattle. Then I went to work for the city of Seattle in its planning department, and my job was dealing with HUD programs. By then they had HUD was no longer promoting large public housing projects, but they were promoting essentially public-private or public nonprofit partnerships. So in Los Angeles, and I assume in the Bay Area, you still have a legacy of these large high-rise public housing projects that are built mostly for seniors. In Los Angeles, you have them in Little Tokyo, in Chinatown, and Bunker Hill. Those are all legacy public housing projects. So when I look at the situation of the homeless, I have this background, and my simple analysis is that most people who are homeless because they have been priced out of homelessness. They have been priced out of housing, and the supply of low-priced housing has been artificially reduced by eliminating these public housing programs. So to understand this and how it happened, we have to understand a concept that mostly is used by academics, but a lot of people have heard of it. It's called neoliberalism. And in England, they also had a term that has been used widely in the United States, devolution. So let me explain what these are. And then you will understand why we have such a housing crisis and so many homeless people right now, and why the remedies make the situation worse. Neoliberalism is also called market fundamentalism, primacy of markets, free markets. It basically is a philosophy that says we need to deregulate the public sphere, and we need to have incentives to private investors, because private investment with incentives will be able to solve all types of social problems, including homelessness and the lack of low-priced housing. Of course, it doesn't work, but this is the ideology. In the case of housing, when I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, we were aware that the HUD public housing programs were already being gutted. And it was immediate and it was widespread. And I remember one of the other students said it was as if everyone had magnets on their shoes and they suddenly rotated. And what happened is most public housing projects were gradually run into the ground by inadequate funding for maintenance. And the result was that the programs were stopped, beginning with Nixon, but also especially by Reagan and Clinton. And this left a giant vacuum. And this brings in the concept of devolution. Devolution, I think, is we associate it with Margaret Thatcher in England, but it applies to the United States. In devolution, you take programs that used to be the responsibility of the central government, or in this case, our federal government, public housing, which some people now call social housing, and you defund it, and you take these defunded programs and assign them to the states. This has happened. You can see this a half a century later in Sacramento with the state legislature, especially with Scott Wiener. But the states don't really take on the responsibility. They further devolve the responsibility for low-cost housing to cities, in some cases counties. And then the counties devolve this process even further and kick the can down the road and stick it to private developers to build the missing low-cost housing. And we've seen well-funded advocacy groups like Livable California and Los Angeles Abundant Housing who are advocates of this approach. And I've noticed that it's widespread right now. It permeates both political parties. And when I'm on a lot of calls with people who should know, they don't really understand the history, but they're always trying to figure out, well, how can we tweak this process, like through tax credits, so private developers will build public or low-priced housing to take the place of the public housing that used to be built in the United States. And my argument that I make through my columns is it simply doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? Private investors have business models, and they expect to make an annual return of 15 to 20% on their investment of housing. So if you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that if you make 1% or less by putting your money into savings accounts, or 1.5% by treasury bills, and you can make 15 to 20% by building market rate housing, that's where you will invest. And there's no shortage. There's absolutely no shortage of speculative investment that is available for developers who want to build housing. But of course, they build profitable housing, and profitable housing in terms of single family houses means McMansions. And in terms of apartment houses, it mostly means upscale, high rise, market rate, and luxury housing. This is what developers want to build. And to try to motivate and encourage developers to build this missing low-priced housing, some cities have imposed what they call inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning says if you build housing, market housing, you have to include a small percentage of the units that will be low-priced housing. A few cities in California do have inclusionary housing, but the big cities like Los Angeles have never adopted inclusionary housing. All housing that is built on paper that is low-priced in the city of Los Angeles is simply voluntary. And the voluntary inducements that the upzoners and the neoliberals and the devolvers have is to increase zoning capacity. They say if developers simply were allowed to build more housing, bigger buildings, higher buildings, larger floor area ratios, they would do it, and this would glut the market, and supply and demand would force down the price of housing, or they will comply with the requirements to have a certain amount of low-priced housing, and this way we'll be able to fill it. It simply doesn't work. And in Los Angeles, the city gathers statistics. The developers have built, I think, probably 15,000 new units per year in Los Angeles. They're only building about 1,000. And when you look at the data very closely, you realize that this 1,000 is not actual units that are low priced and occupied by people who have been approved as low income tenants. This is only building permits. And a lot of the building permits are never built because the developers get the building permits and they get the various approvals to be able to flip their property, because upzoning and building permits and so forth increase the value of the property. So many commercial property owners simply take advantage of it and they flip. And this is one of the great fallacies of upzoning. It increases property values, and to recoup the cost of when developers acquire this property, they have to pay more and they charge more. Plus they want to make a profit. so they have high rents. And this is, we can go into it, why I would argue this doesn't work. So let's drill down from this to the housing element in the city of Los Angeles. And I'm sure other cities have had, I mean, every city now is fixing up its, updating its housing element. This is a statewide general planning requirement. In the case of LA, they have a model that was provided by the Turner Center. For those who don't know, the Turner Center is affiliated with UC Berkeley, but it's largely funded by high-tech people. So it's a private sector funded quasi-public institute at UC Berkeley. And its entire operational philosophy is neoliberalism. We want to give incentives to the private market, like density bonuses or upzoning, to encourage them to build low-priced housing. And quite frankly, it's a mystery. No one has been able to figure out how the city of Los Angeles developed this relationship. There's no evidence of an RFP. They never put out a bid. They never put out an RFP. There were no bids. There were no contracts. The city claims that there was never any. They won't even fess up to that there was an email exchange. So the explanation, but it's simply guesswork, is that the city of Los Angeles got a free model from the Turner Center that was developed. And this free model is trying to figure out how can we develop enough incentives that private developers will build this missing low-priced, very low-income housing. And the only way that they could do this is to upzone and to increase the incentives that are given to developers. So the model uses 13 or 16 different variables, and it relies on what's called regression analysis. So for those of you who remember your college statistics classes, I'm sure if I see a few heads shaking, I understand why you're shaking, because it's hard to remember this stuff. But regression models are, it's a mathematical, it's a statistical tool that looks at current associations, correlations. So as you all have heard, correlation is not cause, but it looks at statistical associations at the present, and it tries to extrapolate them out to the future. So in the case of the housing model of the city of Los Angeles, they tried to come up with a list of variables that will indicate the chance that any one of 700,000 pieces of property that allow apartment houses and residential construction in Los Angeles might be developed by investors in the next 9 years, and that a certain percentage of these new investments would be low income. So the only way they can do this is to upzone these properties and give more incentives to the developers. But why don't these regression models really work? Well, let's think about it. If you had to predict what's going to happen in the future, could you do it? Well, no one can really do it. We don't know how interest rates are going to change. We don't know how tax rates are going to change. We don't know how consumer preferences are going to change. We don't know what breaks there will be in technology, new discoveries of construction. We don't know if there will be more pandemics. I mean, we could make a whole long list of things that are likely to happen, but we don't really know for sure. And the only way that you can ever predict the future through a model is to continuously monitor that model to see if its predictions take place. So in the case of LA, this is, they mostly rely on the Southern California Association of Governments, and they had a population forecast that has been used by the city of LA, which is notoriously bad. One of the plans I worked on was called the General Plan Framework. It was adopted in 1996. It was very good planning. It used a model provided by SCAG that said by the year 2010, Los Angeles would have 4.3 million people. And for those who know or you don't know, in the recent 2020 census, Los Angeles, the population of the city is 3.9 million. So based on SCAG's model, Los Angeles should have already reached 4.3 million people 11 or 12 years ago. So it didn't. And that was because it couldn't anticipate, the model couldn't anticipate the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010, all these other changes. And that's the danger of trying to predict the future by simply assuming that the future is nothing more but a continuation of trends in the present. If this were the case, you wouldn't have history. History would just be one continuous progression of developments, and that simply has never happened. That's why we have history departments and history professors, and we take history classes, because none of this stuff can be easily predicted, and you have to understand exactly why history developed. That's the whole point of being a historian. And this seems to elude the planners and the technical people who try to rely on these models. So what is likely to happen is, despite this model? Well, let's see, I have, you'll excuse me, I had it on my iPad. I have to go back. It stopped. You just hold on for a second. Okay, well, these are some of the things that I predicted. Of course, homelessness will increase. And why will homelessness increase? Well, homelessness will increase because the programs that would provide low-income housing don't exist. And the substitute alternative of trying to do it through private investors doesn't work. Private investors don't want to build low-priced housing because they would lose their shirts. They can't make any money at it, so they don't want to do it, and they resist it. Transit ridership will decline. Transit ridership will decline because developers build expensive housing, and the people who can afford to live and buy and rent expensive housing are upper income people, and upper income people almost always own cars. They drive cars, or if they don't drive cars, they call up Lyft or Uber for a ride. But I'll just give one anecdote. I have a friend who lives in a luxury condo project, for those who know Los Angeles, at the corner of Western and Wilshire, right in Koreatown. He has the Purple Line subway that is right in front of his apartment, his building. He and his wife are the only people who use mass transit. Everyone else in this building who can afford an expensive condo owns a car. So they all have 2 parking spaces. Everybody has 2 cars, and they drive, even though they could just walk downstairs and take the subway or many of the express buses. So this is the reason why transit or ridership will continue to decline as you build more expensive housing. Air pollution and traffic congestion increase. Well, traffic congestion increases because the new tenants own cars and they drive cars. And air pollution increases because there's more cars on the road. And another reason is all of the new buildings have 24/7 HVAC. They all, if you look at any new McMansion, and I mean, in my neighborhood, we have them, and I'm sure wherever you guys live, there's neighborhoods near you that have McMansions. They all have big air conditioning and heating units on the roof, and these things run 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, either heating or cooling the building. So they use a lot of energy. They almost always have 2 fancy cars like a Mercedes or Lexus or something like that in the driveway. So if you want to find a Prius, you don't look for some of the new housing because you won't find it. A few other things. The racial and economic inequality will increase. This is because the city gives the city has policies, excuse me. The city policies increase the value of commercial property by upzoning it. So the people who own commercial property will benefit. People who don't will be hurt. And the other result is that the people who develop property are forced to do infill projects. They can't go ahead and find raw land anymore except on this urban edge. So they look for infill property. Infill property means they have to demolish a house, or they have to demolish a small commercial building, or they have to demolish demolish a small apartment house to replace it with a new expensive McMansion or apartment house. So the result is a gentrification process. And gentrification increases inequality, not just economic inequality, but it increases racial inequality, because a lot of these infill projects take place in what are now predominantly minority neighborhoods. This is the case in Los Angeles, and I'm sure other cities, because this is where you can have existing housing prices that are low. So for those who live in Los Angeles, if you go near South La Cienega, there's an enormous project called the Cumulus Project, very 3 or 4 very large buildings built near mass transit, but of course everyone who will eventually live there drive. And this is in a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood. You can also see the same thing in Los Angeles in the USC area, which is a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood where people have been displaced and replaced mostly by students, but also by people who work in the downtown who can afford expensive housing. And the final thing to understand is that through this entire process, the climate change is accelerated. You will have older buildings which have embedded carbon replaced by new buildings which require lots of carbon for their to produce the building materials and the construction to build the buildings, and then to operate the buildings, and the people in the buildings will drive cars. So these are some of my predictions. Now, it's possible to have a model that would be accurate, but to do this, you have to carefully monitor the model, and you would have to continuously adjust the model. I've looked at the housing element in LA, and there is no monitoring process. The city planning department, which is rapidly getting this model adopted soon by the city council, it'll be embedded in concrete. There will never be a process to go back and see if it works and to see if it is producing any of the lower priced housing and reducing the price of housing. It simply won't happen. There will be no way to see if its variables are accurate or if its forecasts are accurate. So it will simply plug along. Now, the last question I would ask is, well, what, I mean, I'll be happy to, stick with my predictions. And in one of my columns, I invited people to clip the column or save it and go back to it and see if these things are forecast. How will the politicians respond? I can't imagine that, given their commitment to neoliberalism, that they will say, oh, we made a mistake, we have to go back to public housing, and maybe we'll raise wages so people won't be priced out of housing. I don't think they'll do this. I think they'll simply barrel on. And in Los Angeles, and probably in other cities, they rely increasingly on the police. In Los Angeles, according to the Los Angeles Times, the city council has identified 300 homeless encampments that they have declared will be off limits. They will be illegal because people are camping on public property, and the LAPD will be called in to eject these people. But of course, there is, even the Los Angeles Times, which is kind of a YIMBY newspaper, concedes that there isn't any public housing or private low-priced housing for these people. So they'll simply take their shopping carts, they'll take their tents, and they'll move to another overpass or another alley, and they'll reestablish another encampment. So then whoever is the city council person for that area will declare that it's illegal. It's illegal camping. So this is a never-ending process that simply displaces the people who are homeless, and the overall number of homeless people increase. So the public officials will increasingly rely on the police without any effective solution. And just one point, and then I'm going to do it. In writing about this process, I realized that this is not the first time in LA that our elected officials use this anti-camping ordinance as a way to crack down. This was used for the attack on the Occupy movement in Los Angeles. the city council and our mayor then, Antonio Villaraigosa, said that it is illegal to camp in public parks. They quickly declared that the lawns around City Hall were a public park. And in the middle of the night, 1,400 LAPD members, all dressed up in SWAT uniforms, attacked 300 remaining occupiers, and they beat them up and they arrested them and fined them and kept them in jail for about a week. So this is what I predict will happen. There'll be a lot of anti-camping ordinances and a lot of efforts to use the police to crack down on the homeless. So I'm going to take a lot of questions and we'll have discussion at this point.